Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom made its international debut on December 22nd, 2023, and a few days later, I, along with millions of others, went to see it with my family over the holidays. Now, like most fans of the superhero genre, I was aware of the difficulties this film faced, but as an environmental studies and economics student, what I took to most while watching the movie was the role the environment played. I started writing the script the day after seeing the movie, and as you'll come to see, it's taken me into a variety of different environmental topics, even Aquaman's. Hence, the broad title of this video, Aquaman Environmentalism. Now, before getting into some of my thoughts, I want to start with some disclaimers. First, I'm well aware that I'm dealing with sort of low-hanging fruit. There's a sense in which, as a feel-good superhero movie, the last movie in the DCEU, and one with a variety of reshoots, it was almost impossible for the movie to address some of the things I'll be talking about. For this reason, I want to make it clear I'm not bashing anyone involved in this movie. God knows I'm not an actor, screenwriter, or director. Having said this though, in defense of this video, it is possible to write an Aquaman story that avoids climate change and the related topics that we'll get into, opting instead to focus on the Black Manta revenge story with themes of family and personal identity, or a story with the Lost Kingdom and sort of unveiling the troubled history of Atlantis. Since they included the environment, I think I have some right to talk about it. It is in this sense that I also want to make it explicitly clear my main goal, as someone interested in these topics, is to just explore how these movies contend with environmental issues, what the movie may be trying to get at in the real world, how these various discussions and projects are panning out in the real world, and how future on-screen interpretations of Aquaman may approach environmentalism if they choose to do so. Also, spoiler, I will be discussing the plot. Aquaman has always been a character uniquely tied to the environment. Whereas Batman is the genius tactician and combat expert, Superman is the flying, strong, alien guy, Aquaman is the one that talks to fishes. He also lives in / rules over Atlantis, the lost underwater civilization of great power that is both technologically advanced yet carefully integrated with the ocean ecosystems. Of his many titles, he is the, quote, protector of the seas. In the most recent live-action interpretation of the character, by Jason Momoa in the DCEU, the sort of overarching dilemma in both movies is the relationship between Atlantis and the surface world. In a modern age when above-water human activity is starting to encroach into the ocean via rising temperatures, pollution, acidification, and overfishing, Atlanteans are forced to question their centuries of silence. In the first movie released in 2018, Aquaman's brother Orm, then King of Atlantis, wants to wage war on the surface world for the threats they pose to Atlantis and the underwater world more broadly. He sends a massive wave, Aquaman comes to beat him up because war is bad, and he ends the movie as king. Obviously this is a crude retelling for an actually pretty great movie, but you get the gist. Now, this movie is interesting environmentally in its own right because the environmental concerns Orm raises are never really resolved. Sure, it's made clear to the viewer that his means are bad and that he was a power-hungry narcissist, but what are to be made of his arguments? As Noah Berlatsky says in this opinion piece that I think is well worth reading, at the end of Aquaman, Arthur is inevitably declared monarch and Orm is sent packing, but what happens to the ocean? Or to the planet? Orm puts aside his crown and the knowledge that Aquaman will soon be king, not of the seven seas, but of a garbage dump. Additionally, although it is insinuated that Jason Momoa's character appreciates the concern Orm raises and that their dilemma is one of means, not end, we don't ever really see him protecting the seas, as his title suggests, and as he does in other Aquaman media that we'll get into later. In the second movie, this plot surrounding the continued silence or revelation of Atlantis remains, with the main villain here being a possessed Black Manta who burns a fictionalized fossil fuel equivalent named orichalcum that
emits tremendous amounts of greenhouse gases that are highly destructive to our planet.
He does this in a bid to free his possessor, Kordax, the brother of Atlantis founder King Atlan and ruler of the lost kingdom of Nekris, by raising global temperatures and subsequently melting the ice that has imprisoned Kordax and his kingdom for centuries. In the end, Aquaman essentially teams up with an exiled Orm to stop the burning of the orichalcum and the freeing of Kordax, and the movie ends with Aquaman revealing Atlantis to the world and giving an uplifting speech as it joins the UN and more broadly the fight against climate change in this sort of non-violent, diplomatic way emblematic of Jason Momoa's Aquaman. Now, before getting into my sort of major points, I want to touch on two sort of smaller rants. First, product placement. The famous Irish beer brand Guinness features notably in the movie.
You know what would be amazing right now? We're hitting 4 splits, a great big greasy cheeseburger, and a pint of Guinness.
Now, it's not uncommon to see a big brand in a superhero movie, and I'm certainly not saying there's no place for any sort of product placement in a film. But again, in a film with an environmental message, it seems sort of strange. Beer is certainly not one of the top contributors to climate change, but as with any industry, it is not spotless. This article that I found evaluating the craft beer industry estimates that alcoholic beverages, including beer, account for only 0.7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with the farming of barley, the transportation, and the production of bottles sort of being the major contributors. In terms of the cans themselves, Guinness aluminum cans and even their plastic widgets seem to be recyclable, although I've seen it suggested it depends slightly on your local recycling system. In any case, even assuming it is, because of their sort of single-use nature, they often, through accident, ease, or neglect, end up tossed in places they shouldn't be, like most beer cans, and contributing to sort of physical, not chemical, environmental pollution. I'm not sure if this tactic would just sort of fall under the scheme of celebrity marketing, or sort of more broadly, under the infamous environmental title of corporate greenwashing. This is of course the PR tactic in which a company tries to appear more environmentally friendly than it is to push product. Jason Momoa is not of course saying Guinness is a sustainable company or anything, however you do certainly leave the movie with the impression Aquaman sure loves his Guinness, and if he, the protector of the seas, is cool with single-use beer plastic, then maybe you the viewer should be too. I guess what I'm saying more than anything is that it kinda seems in bad taste. This criticism remains true for his brief but sort of noted riding of motorcycles. Like, of course, on one hand, who cares? This is a little 10-second montage, but equally, I feel like there's a reason in doing some digging I can't find any comic or other on-screen interpretation of Aquaman where he rides a Harley. The only thing related I could find is a panel of Mira riding what seemed like sort of an Atlantic electric bike. Like this slow motion scene alone could even get David Suzuki to buy one. Now, onto my second little rant, the giant mutated animals. When Orn and Aquaman first arrive at Black Manta's secret lair island, they are greeted by a variety of antagonistic and oversized plant and animal life. Orn posits the movie's explanation for this when he says,
You see how dangerous the orichalcum can be? I bet it mutated the flora and fauna in a short amount of time.
Now, I probably don't have to tell you that greenhouse gas emissions cannot induce directly mutations in insect species. From what I gather, it kind of can change plant life directly as photosynthesis increases with rising CO2 emissions, an effect actually known as the CO2 fertilization effect, and which is why certain forested regions in our planet right now actually have appeared sort of greener over the past few decades. But even then, this mechanism certainly does not explain the 10x size new species of Venus flytrap the movie shows that apparently happens in 5 months. Otherwise, changes in precipitation pattern, temperature, and plant life, as discussed, certainly can impact animal species because of their dependence on their natural environment. But again, from what I gather, these sort of changes will be more along the lines of just certain species dying off, while others repopulate more efficiently in a climate suited to them. Now, even if we grant that orichalcum has some sort of unique magical property that allows it to induce these changes, I would still be slightly confused by this scene's addition thematically. It is of course suggested at different parts of the movie that the surface is experiencing other impacts from emissions, but the dangerous animals is the only one that's actually given a scene. If you're looking to show the severity of climate change and the destructiveness of greenhouse gas emissions, why not show actual problems? Show Aquaman swimming over a bleached out coral reef, or a pot of fish dead because their water is no longer habitable with acidification. Even a TV shot of a massive wildfire or increasingly intense hurricanes. Whether consciously or unconsciously, I feel like kids probably left that movie with the idea that GHG emissions are bad, but because I don't want giant grasshoppers chasing me one day. Now to get into some more larger topics, I want to explore how Aquaman in the movie's perception of climate change and the role Atlantis plays is written into the movie with 2 quotes. First, halfway through the movie, when Aquaman is talking to the Atlantis Council, and he says,
You can't expect them to care about what happens to us if they don't even know we exist. If you want to be a part of the conversation, we have to take our seat at the table.
Then, in his final speech at the UN, when he says this,
I'm calling for global unity for a global crisis. Atlantis stands ready to help contribute its science and technology. Together we can write the next chapter in our story, rather than its ending.
With these 2 scenes in mind, what we essentially get is Aquaman's argument for why Atlantis should reveal itself to the world in the interest of themselves and the climate. 1. Making them aware will make them care. 2. Using our tech and knowledge of the ocean will help. Now what this first quote is obviously getting at is a sort of approach to environmentalism and social change more broadly that says if a people or country or cause spread enough information about their plight, there is a sense of universal human empathy that will birth swift action. This is the sort of approach, of course, that views media campaigning and public awareness as sort of the best avenues or strategies for change. Now, I'm not interested in staunchly debating whether or not this is true, but I think it's interesting to bring Atlantis to the real world and consider a somewhat similar case in the country of Tuvalu. For longtime YouTube watchers, you may remember this video from a few years ago that has now garnered over 16 million views, where the guys from Yes Theory travel to, quote, the least visited country in the world, the small Pacific island of Tuvalu. I mention this because for many young people, including myself, this was sort of the first time I'd ever heard of this country. I also mention this because the video was so impactful that it actually features prominently on the country's Wikipedia page. Now, as discussed in that video, Tuvalu is a beautiful island with incredibly unique culture, history, and way of life. It is also one of many island nations that will experience the most immediate impacts of climate change and rising sea levels, such that according to NASA, much of their land, along with critical infrastructure, will be below the average high tide by 2050. Now, it's obviously incorrect to say that Tuvalu hasn't existed or been making their cause known before this video, but I do think it's fair to say generally that their story hasn't taken a hold in the public consciousness until the last 5 years or so, especially with their foreign minister's symbolic speech from their rising waters at COP26 in 2021.
We are living the realities of climate change, sea level rise, as you stand watching me today at COP26. We cannot wait for speeches when the sea is rising around us all the time. Climate mobility must come to the forefront. We must take bold, alternative action today to secure tomorrow. Faftailasi, Tuvalu Modetua.
So perhaps revelation isn't the word, but popularization in the world consciousness. Now, in using Tuvalu as a sort of case study for Atlantis, we may ask ourselves, what has the response to Tuvalu's plight been? Did the unveiled struggles of a fellow civilization, more dependent on the conditions of the ocean than other nations, significantly change the way those countries dealt with climate change? In the field of climate mitigation at COP26, Tuvalu, along with basically every country, called for nations to commit to the 1.5 degree warming limit that has been set by the IPCC. Suffice it to say that since then, many countries have taken swift action, but generally nowhere near enough, with reports leading up to this past COP28 meeting saying current policies are on track for something more like 3 or even 4 degrees of heating by the end of the century if changes aren't made. Now, in terms of climate adaptation, Australia has offered to relocate Tuvalu residents displaced by the rising sea levels. The World Bank has approved a $13 million grant for the fisheries of Tuvalu, which of course their economy is heavily dependent on. And domestically, their government has invested in a project to make 7.3 hectares of raised land designed to remain above the rising sea levels in years to come. All of this is to say that I don't think an underwater country revealing itself to the world and making a similar plea to empathize and take action on their behalf would actually do anything in and of itself. Now, of course, the scale is so much different here. From what we're shown, Atlantis holds a large military, certainly more than an island of 10,000 like Tuvalu, and this planet has seen no end to military superpowers enforcing their political agendas via the threat of their military, but I don't think this would happen because in this universe, Jason Momoa's Aquaman has made it explicitly clear that he will avoid war with the surface at all costs and wants to engage in the democratic avenues of change to
Take our seat at the table.
not threaten to flood the table if they don't do what he wants. With this in mind, of course, we see how writing this sort of message into the movie is maybe odd. I know this take on Aquaman is very much Thor-like in the sense that he's a sort of well-intentioned, noble himbo, but for the vaguely informed, it does seem like the, quote, protector of the seas is saying, how do you expect the robber not to rob you if he doesn't know what you need that money for? Which he could say, I guess, if that blind optimism was then challenged later on in the movie. Now, to venture into advice, I think one interesting play on this showing the realities of international climate affairs was shown in my beloved animated Justice League of 20 years ago. In Season 1, Episode 6, titled The Enemy Below, we are introduced to the Aquaman of this universe, and we jump sort of right into a similar story where he has decided to reveal himself and Atlantis to the world at the UN in the interest of the oceans. In this universe, however, we have a more disgruntled Aquaman, who instead of giving a speech about rainbows and unicorns, takes a seat at the table and lists his demands. To which a man, presumably the sort of secretary head of the UN, responds with,
"But your demands are outrageous. They would compromise our entire world defense and economy."
Your problem, not mine.
Obviously, this is not genius dialogue, but I think it does at least try to address the dismissal or antagonism that unknown or smaller countries often face when making these larger pleas in international affairs. Now, onto the second point. Using our tech and knowledge of the ocean will help. What is of course implied here is that Atlantean technology can be used on the surface in terms of climate change solutions. Now, as previously mentioned, Atlantis is imagined sort of like Wakanda in the Marvel universe as this isolationist ancient society that is sort of paradoxically very technologically advanced. From what I gather online and from the movie, however, this tech seems mostly related to war. They have hydrocannons along their walls, high-tech suits, genetically modified spy octopi, energy blasters that use water and don't need to be reloaded, and taser staffs that only electrocute who you touch and not everyone else because electricity is famously not water conductive. They also have underwater cars and water telegrams, along with all the mechanics and laws behind these inventions. Last and perhaps most usefully though, it's revealed in the first movie that Atlantis has access to an unlimited power source, although I'm not exactly clear on what this is. Now, with this background in mind, to imagine how science and tech may be used to solve environmental issues, I think it's first useful to break down the actual issues into two categories: problems and mysteries. Now, this may seem a little strange and pretentious, but I encourage you to give it a shot. This is a paradigm or sort of system of classification I learned this semester, and because I don't care to explain it and my professor probably won't mind, I'll play this short clip.
So the way in which I try and think about it as a professor has been influenced by the work of another philosopher, a French philosopher named Gabriel Marcel. And Marcel made a big distinction between what he called problems and mysteries. Problems comes from a Greek word called problemata, which is things that are thrown down in front of us. And these problems are things that stand outside us. And these he distinguished between those and mysteries. Mysteries engulf us, they involve us, they are the kinds of things that we are incapable of solving by standing outside them. We are within them, and that's part of the struggle.
Now, I know that probably doesn't make anything super clear, so I'd like to put in an application by suggesting that a problem may be something like plastic pollution or overfishing that can exist outside of ourselves and are the result of themselves, i.e., overfishing is achieved by overfishing. Literally, some dude somewhere, not you, killing too many fish. Mysteries, on the other hand, may be something like ocean acidification, which is the raising of pH levels, which is the result of increased carbon in the atmosphere, which is then the result of a variety of different avenues and types of human emissions. It is almost impossible to deal with this issue without looking inward, without dealing with deeper questions about our culture and way of life. With this framing in mind, it's easy to see how problems are sort of easier to deal with. The relationship between the cause and effects are immediate, tangible, visible, and their solutions are accordingly, I think, not generally stuck in the phase of creation, but of enforcement. For example, one direct bad Orrin gestures to in the first movie is that of commercial whaling. In the 20th century, an estimated 2.9 million large whales were killed for commercial purposes. In this age, whales were a highly desired commodity because whale oil was used in a variety of products from oil lamps to soap to margarine. With the growth of the environmental movement and concerns around species extinction, the International Whaling Commission instituted a moratorium or ban on whaling in 1986 that technically stands to this day. While many countries objected to the decision and have continued whaling in small quantities, the banning of whaling seems to have somewhat worked, although this is probably also due to the fact we don't use whale oil as much. In any case, it seems as if many species of whales are coming back at best and not dropping at the same rates they were in the 20th century at worst. Hence, as I said, enforcement seems to be more so the issue, and in my mind, this seems like something Aquaman and Atlantis could conceptually deal with. In this recent Aquaman, there's a scene in which a covert security squid reports Black Manta's stealing of orichalcum from an Atlantean vault for Aquaman and the Atlantis guards to respond to, almost like an underwater security camera or tripwire. One could imagine a network of these or other animals sort of across the ocean acting like an alarm system to alert Atlantean forces to breaches of whaling bans. In fact, in doing research for this video, I stumbled upon this PhD thesis that references an Aquaman comic that has partially explored whaling bans. In Aquaman New 52, issue 17, we open on a horrifying scene in which whale poachers are slaughtering a pod of whales. A group of environmentalists quickly approach in order to stop the whaling and cite the actual ban from the IWC. This, of course, means nothing to the poachers, and Aquaman's arrival is eventually what stops the conflict. Here, he actually protects the seas. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to sort of go down this hypothetical trail a little more and consider what dealing with problems by means of sort of watching, information, and surveillance would look like in our world given our on-land disputes currently about privacy. Establishing this sort of network to prevent illegal whaling or plastic pollution would also presumably mean Atlantis would have other information, like maybe the specific amounts of industrial runoff in areas, or individual quantities of sunscreen pollution, even maybe the location of Navy ships, nuclear submarines, and those who sleep with the fishes. With the current wave of debates surrounding digital privacy and social media, it's interesting to imagine a world where underwater privacy in Atlantis is something that's debated in parliaments and congresses around the world. I think it's interesting to consider how governments and intelligence agencies would respond to this sort of power. Now, to deal with the other half, mysteries, I think this is a side that gets even more interesting. First and foremost, the most useful thing Atlantis could probably provide to the world to these ends are a clean and unlimited source of energy. As it stands today, so much of climate change seems tied back to fossil fuel burning for energy, whether that be to generate electricity for lighting, fuel transportation, or to work machinery in manufacturing or food production. If we could reduce all that fossil fuel burning to zero, that would drastically reduce emissions, but obviously it wouldn't happen overnight. Whether the source of energy is replicable in the way that nuclear power plants are, or it would need to stay on Atlantis. Large infrastructure projects would have to be taken in order to make the energy accessible to places, especially landlocked countries, in the case that it's not replicable. This obviously raises a variety of geopolitical issues that would have to be squashed. This also presumes that the source is not immediately commercialized in any way. I think we often forget that other fundamental resources like water and food are more than abundant, yet remain unequally distributed. As of a decade ago, we produce actually 20% more food than we need, but due to distribution failures, which can be blamed on a mix of capitalism, bad government, globalization, and colonialism, we still have 9 million people a year who die from hunger alone. I can almost envision like a rich American opportunist type who tries patenting the technology, or even more broadly, fossil fuel dominant countries or corporations trying to stifle access to the infinite Atlantean energy source in different bureaucratic ways. In any case, assuming the energy is employed internationally, you of course have to contend with the potential secondary effects of low energy costs. Without the costs associated with the extraction of fossil fuels and assuming the average fixed infrastructure costs of implementing the new energy source sort of decrease or level out over time, I think it's fair to expect lower energy prices at worst and even approaching completely free at best. If we allow this scenario for a second, you may be familiar with the idea that price drops are equivalent to income increases because you have essentially more money or purchasing power. In economics, we call this the income effect. Where I live, in Ontario, Canada, for example, the average person spends about $3,000 annually on gas for their car. In the US, this number is apparently more like $5,000. In terms of energy in the house, Yahoo Finances put Canadian annual expenditures on electricity, heating, and cooling at $2,000 a year. With the often talked about relationship between energy prices and food prices, it's perhaps not foolish to think as well that this would mean a decrease in grocery bills, which, as it sits currently, is $16,000 annually for Canadians. All of this, again, is to say that a decrease would mean anything from maybe a few $100s to tens of thousands of dollars. Now, I won't go into what this means for the environment because perhaps this should be the topic of a whole separate video, but I'll leave you with this consideration. It's often thought that with more money, people will be free to act more environmentally friendly. Buy the Tesla, build the solar panels, or buy organic foods. But this may not actually be the case. There's a famous 2015 Oxfam study that shows that the richest 10% are responsible for more than 50% of the world's lifestyle-related emissions. The simplified idea, of course, here is that with the more money you have, you just sort of consume more things, and so many things in our lives use fossil fuels. Now, to attempt to reel in this rant, what I'm saying is that in a world where our fish-talking sex symbol exists, Atlantis could definitely help the environment, but it's likely that it would be contentious, probably be slow, and definitely be more complicated than I think most people or the movie imagines. And I think this gets at my more deep uneasiness about the movie. I almost don't like the ending because it works. A movie that tackles climate change is functionally resolved by the promise of new tech. I think this reflects a sort of bystander effect with respect to green technology that a lot of the younger generation, especially the sort of tech bro-y environmentalist types, ascribe to. For those unfamiliar, the bystander effect is a psychological theory that essentially tells you if you're on a train and someone gets injured, you're less likely to help them if you're surrounded by other people because you hope someone else will step in. I imagine the climate crisis as an injured person on a train full of a group of uni friends, with technology being the one pre-med student. With our limited understanding and good intention, we turn to the pre-med student to save our dying planet, yet immediately we realize they are inept. Not because they can't do something, or that one day they may be able to help more profoundly, but because today they don't have the knowledge or tools. In doing research for this video, I've come to learn that this idea, or at least something similar, has been given a rather cool name: techno-optimism. In this interesting analysis of techno-optimism by John Danaher, he begins by recounting a Jeff Bezos quote taken from an interview with journalist Brad Stone. Here, Stone asks Bezos about climate change and the role of technology in resolving it, to which Bezos answers, quote, "I really do believe when ingenuity gets involved, when invention gets involved, when people get determined and when passion comes out, when they make strong goals, you can invent your way out of any box. That's what we humans need to do right now. I believe we're going to do it right now. I'm sure we're going to do it." For Danaher, this encapsulates the soul of this philosophy. Technology, when combined with human passion and ingenuity, is the key to unlocking a better world. Now, when you consider a domain like medicine, it's hard to argue that this has not been the case. Whether it's been X-rays, MRIs, ECGs, or vaccines, advancements in science and technology is no doubt single-handedly responsible for saving millions, perhaps even billions of lives. But is this sort of general optimism warranted for a problem like climate change? Now, before even beginning to tackle this, I want to say that I think the time frame and ceiling is obviously very important in determining your answer. For the sake of this discussion, I'm going to be talking a bit about technology with respect to the UN Conference of the Parties 1.5 degree threshold, or the sort of net zero by 2050 paradigm. Now, even then, technology is obviously an incredibly broad topic, and there's a variety of inventions and projects we may turn to, but two areas I'm interested in, so I'll talk about, are renewable energies and carbon capture technologies. Now, according to the UN, about 29% of electricity comes from renewable sources now. This is a number at the end of a steady upward slope, and is in no small part due to a mix of efficiency advancements, material cost drops, and government subsidization that has meant that the cost of renewables, like wind and solar, have dropped significantly in the past decade. For even the biggest pessimist, it's hard not to crack a grin at this trend. However, I think when looking at renewables, a sort of devil's advocate would be quick to point out a few things. First, in general, fossil fuels still account for more than 80% of global energy production, and two, renewables are complicated. For example, while solar is inexpensive per megawatt and quick to get online compared to others, sometimes these numbers don't account for the costs associated with battery storage or repairs that often dissuade people from investing in solar. Last summer, there was a sort of nichely infamous story of a 14,000 module solar farm in Nebraska that got largely destroyed when the state underwent a hailstorm, after which significant parts of the grid had to be thrown in the landfill, which is another problem inherent to solar cost as it stands today: longevity. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, we could expect a total of 78 million tons of solar-related waste by the year 2050, with a large amount anticipated in the early 2030s. The second big thing with solar is, of course, reliability, in terms of the what if it gets cloudy argument, which has dissuaded a lot of northern or sort of more cloudy areas from investing in this sort of energy. There are sort of similar problems with wind and other ones with hydro. For these reasons, I think there's always been a cautiousness towards solar and renewables, in the sense that we want their share of the pie to increase, but the question of course is, will we ever feel comfortable with them fully taking over? Which transitions well into my next technology, because net zero emissions can be achieved in a world where we still get some energy from fossil fuels if we have carbon capture technologies. Now for this, I will plead you to read this article written by the ISSD, which offers a very readable deep dive of the issue in a Canadian context, with the bullet points being that, as it stands today, much of the technology, like solar once was, is just too expensive, difficult to scale up, and very energy/emissions intensive in its own paradoxical right. Beyond these sort of inherent problems right now, you also have the sort of troubling way it's been applied. In the best case scenario, you would of course want carbon capture to counteract fossil fuel emissions as they currently stand, but it seems often the case that fossil fuel companies themselves will buy these technologies in order to justify emitting more than they already are. Now, I've painted quite a depressive picture, but I want to make it clear that my sort of pessimism towards the role technology plays in fighting environmental problems is not absolute. It would require perhaps a longer video delving into why I think, in light of these challenges, we should continue to pursue them, but I will also say that in general, it's hard to count out a field as uniquely innovative as technology. New stuff comes out every day, and even with the trends developing right now, anything is possible in this domain. My larger point, however, is that in the short term, I think we, and accordingly the movie, perhaps underestimate the role that individuals or culture play in this game. If the way we live and consume right now depends on fossil fuels, and it's not clear we can change that to renewables or utilize carbon capture, then perhaps we have to change the other side of the equation. I imagine it almost like math. If one term is how much we consume and the other term is of what, right now 2 plus 2 equals 4, and we want it to get to 3. To do this, we can either change 1 to 1 or both to 1.5, meaning introducing more renewables, limiting the use of energy, or some combination of both. In economic terms, the way I would think about this is if we graphed our demand for fossil fuels and we had some level of consumption, if we wanted to shift that line to the left or decrease our aggregate demand for fossil fuels, we could do a couple things, but two of them are: one, a decrease in the price of a substitute, meaning a substitute source of energy like renewables become more enticing, and that sort of facilitates our consumption. Two is that general consumer preferences change and less people are consuming fossil fuels and their related products. In sum, the sort of environmental angle in Aquaman in the Lost Kingdom was interesting to me on two fronts. One, it's fun to think about how the existence or revelation of Atlantis would play out in the real world. And second, I think it's insightful to reflect upon the techno-optimism that seems to lie at the heart of the film. In a perfect world, I think an environmentally conscious Aquaman movie shows him protecting the seas, contending with the complexity of international affairs as they pertain to the variety of environmental mysteries, shows the variety of real concerns related to emissions, isn't cheapened by product placement, and shows how technology may be put to use if it alludes to its utility. I also think that, while it can of course resolve with Aquaman beating the bad guy, there's no reason why it can't leave the viewers with a thoughtful uneasiness or realism when it comes to climate change, and perhaps the broader sense that we the viewers play a role, that we may learn something from Atlantis not only from their science and technology, but from their ecologically considerate low impact, low consumption, integrated Atlantean way of life. With that being said, this marks the end of my first YouTube video. If you enjoyed, leave a like. If you have anything you want to add or think there are things I might have gotten wrong or overlooked, please leave a comment because I'll be the first to admit I am far from an expert on any of these things. These are just some of my ideas. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. And with the amount of time I've put into this, I realized I may as well make a Patreon in case there's anybody out there who feels like helping me justify this use of my time. Now, I'd like to leave you in the hands of my professor to reflect on this.
But now we have entered this era where it isn't just simple problems that can be solved. It is questions about what it means to be human, how do we fuel ourselves, how do we deal with technology, with capitalism, and with the future progress of the human race and the other species with whom we share this planet. And that is why we have entered onto a period of mystery.